Good morning everyone. Myself Abdullah Sherikar, working as an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Sri Vileparli Kelavani Mandal Institute of Pharmacy. Today we are going to give some inputs or the insight on the introduction of the endocrine system. After completion of this lecture or the video, the learners will able to understand the what is the chemical messenger system, the definition of the hormones. Third, that is the what is the difference between the neurotransmitter and endocrine hormones. Fourth, the what are the different type of the hormonal glands that secrete the different type of the hormones or the chemical messengers. And fifth, the different classification of the hormones and along with mode of action. Before starting to the lecture, the first we should know the what is mean by the endocrine system. As we are known that the as the girls and the boys enter into the puberty, they start to develop the striking differences in their particularly physical appearance or as well as the behavior. Let's take an example. In girls, the release of the or the secretion of the estrogen promote the accumulation of the adipose tissue, particularly in the breast and the hip region, that giving a feminine shape. And at the same time or this some little time after this, the increase in the blood testosterone level in the particularly in the boys begins to develop the or the increases the muscle mass as well as the enlarge the vocal cords, and that is giving or the producing or the developing a lower pitched voice. By seeing or by observing these changes, one can understand just that these are the some few examples in which the powerful influence of the endocrine system or the its function. So less dramatically, if you see the perhaps multitudes of the hormones that basically on the daily basis help to maintain the body's homeostasis. They regulate the some example, say example, they regulate on daily basis the activity of the smooth muscle or the cardiac muscles or the some glands. Again, they alter the metabolism, regulate the growth and development, then influence the growth of the reproductive system both in the male as well as the female. They also participate in the circadian cycle and the on daily basis the rhythmically activity, that is the coordinated rhythmically activities established by these hypothalamus. These are some activities under control of the endocrine system. See, if you see the multiple activities of the cells, basically, or the tissue or the organs of the body, these are coordinated by the interplay or the role of the several type of the chemical messengers. So, first messenger is the neurotransmitters. Say example, these are released by the axon terminals from the neurons, particularly into synaptic junctions, and these neurotransmitter act locally to control the nerve functions in response to the action potential generated by these chemicals or the neurotransmitter. Second example is the endocrine system. These are released by the endocrine hormones. These are the released by the glands or the specialized cells particularly into the blood, and after the blood level or the circulating concentration of these endocrine hormone influence the function of the cells at a particular another location where the receptor for the hormones are present and where they control the activity of the cells. Third example is the neuroendocrine hormones. These are the chemical messengers released by the neurons, particularly in the blood. Isn't it? In response, is in comparison to if you see the neurotransmitter, these are released by the neurons. In second, the endocrine hormones, these are released by the glands, particularly in the blood. But the neuroendocrine hormones, these are released by the neurons, particularly into the circulation or the blood, where they influences the functions of the cells at the another location in the body, as that of the endocrine hormones. Fourth example is the paracrines hormones. These are the some chemical messengers. These are released by the cells into the, particularly into the extracellular fluid, and they affect the activity of the or the function of the neighboring cells of a different type. Next example is the autocrine. These are also released by the cells, particularly in the extracellular fluid, but in comparison to the paracrines, these autocrines affect the function of the same cells that produce them by binding to the cell surface receptor. These chemical messengers are called as the autocrines. Next, last example is the cytokines. These are the peptides secreted by the cells, particularly into the extracellular fluid. And the cytokines, they can function as autocrine or the paracrine or the endocrine hormones. Means they are categorized both as a paracrine or the autocrine or the endocrine hormones. Now the most of the, if you see the many of the body chemical messenger system interact with one another, say example endocrine system and a neuroendocrine system. These two system interact, particularly coordinated activity is going to happen in these two type of the system that basically helps to maintain the homeostasis of our body. Let's take an example. If you see the neural stimuli that received at the adrenal medulla as well as the pituitary gland, both these the adrenal gland or the pituitary gland, these are activated by the some input, say example neural stimuli, and in that response they secrete the some kind of the hormones. Now there are some neuroendocrine cells. These are located particularly in the hypothalamus, and these neuroendocrine cells have their axons particularly in the posterior pituitary gland or the median eminence, and from there they secrete some kind of the hormones, particularly on the anterior pituitary gland. Say example, these are the examples of the hormones are the antidiuretic hormone or the oxytocin or the, say example, hypophysiotropic hormones. Basically these hormones control the or the secretion of the anterior pituitary hormones. Now the endocrine hormones, these are the released by the endocrine gland, particularly into the circulation. Means the endocrine gland releases these chemical messengers into the interstitial fluid, and from the interstitial fluid these hormones enter into the circulation, that is the blood, and from blood circulation these endocrine systems are transported to the different organs or the system where they have specific receptors on that. After binding to the receptor on particular system or the organs, they produces the several cellular reactions. Take an example, the growth hormone. It is released by the anterior pituitary gland or regulate the growth of the overall body structures. And the second example is the release of the thyroxine from the thyroid gland that increases the cellular reactions all over the body. So the growth hormone or the thyroxine hormone, they basically regulate the growth as well as the cellular reactions all are on the body, isn't it? So there are some other hormones that are called as the tissue specific hormones. They release they release from a specific site and target the specific tissues. Take an example, the release of the adrenocorticotropic hormone, that is the ACTH, from the anterior pituitary gland. Basically it produces the biphasic response or a two type of the responses. So example, first it act on the adrenal cortex where it regulate the secretion of the adrenocortical hormone, and second one it stimulate the release of the ovarian hormone that ultimately affect the development of the sexual characteristics, particularly in the female. Now if you see the definition of the hormone, if you consider hormone is nothing but to excite the agent which has ability to excite or they get moving. And these hormones, basically these are the mediators released from one part of the body and regulate the activity of the other body cells. And after the release from the cells, these hormones or the chemical mediators enters the cell fluid and then into the blood stream, where the circulating system or the circulating blood delivers these hormones to the cells throughout the body. Now we will focus on the difference between the neurotransmitter or the endocrine hormones, or the difference between the nervous system or the endocrine system. Basically, if you see, the endocrine system releases the hormones and that delivered to the tissue throughout the body by the blood or the circulation. If you see, in case of the neurotransmitter or the nervous system releases the neurotransmitter basically locally in response to the nerve impulses. Second point, the endocrine system, the endocrine hormones, these hormones act throughout the body cells, and if you see the neurotransmitter released by the nervous system, they basically act on the muscle, specific muscle or a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or the skeletal cells or the glands or the other neurons. The effect produced by the, or the time taken by the, or the onset of the action for the endocrine hormones, that is measured in the it takes the second or the hours or the 2 days to produce a cellular effect. When if you see in comparison to the hormones, the neurotransmitter, they start to show effect within the millisecond. And generally the duration of the action of the endocrine hormone, generally it is a longer, or the second to the days. And if you see in case of the neurotransmitter, the duration of the action of the neurotransmitter, generally it is a briefer for a few milliseconds. And the site of location for the endocrine system, if you see for the endocrine hormones, it is far from the site of the release usually, basically, or they bind to the receptors on or to the target cell. And if you see the neurotransmitter, after releasing from a specific neurons, they act to the closer site, their closer site, and particularly at the synaptic level, and they bind to the receptor on the postsynaptic membrane. That is the basic difference between the neurotransmitter and endocrine hormones. Now if you see take example of the endocrine glands, there are two type of the endocrine glands. One is the endocrine gland, that is the inside, and second one is the exocrine gland, that is the outside. So exocrine glands, they release the product into the particularly, or they secrete their product into this duct, and from the duct it is again transported into the body cavities or the lumen of an organ, or into the outer surface of the body. If you see the endocrine hormones, they basically release into the interstitial fluid, and from the interstitial fluid they enter into the circulation, and from the circulating system they are transported or they distributed throughout the body cells. In comparison to the endocrine hormones or the glands, or the exocrine glands, they secrete their product into the from the ductal system into the local body cavities or the lumen of the organ or the outer surface of the body. Now the example of the exocrine glands, there are 3 to 4 type of the examples are there. Exocrine glands. One is the sudoriferous gland, that is the sweat gland. Second example of the exocrine gland is the sebaceous gland. Third example of the exocrine gland is the digestive gland, and fourth example is the mucous gland. Now the examples of the endocrine glands. If you see, as earlier I told that the endocrine glands secrete the hormones particularly into the interstitial fluid surrounding the ductal secretory cells. There is no ductal involvement, and from the interstitial fluid the hormones diffuse into the blood capillaries, and from blood capillaries they enter into the circulation, and through the blood circulatory system they are distributed or transported to the target cells throughout the body. So if you see the by observing these system, that endocrine glands are vascular tissues of the body, means in order to distribute the hormones to their target site, there needs a circulation or the blood circulation. So endocrine glands, because of their dependence on the cardiovascular system for their distribution into the different target site in the throughout the body, so these endocrine glands are highly vascularized system or the tissue of the body. And if you see the hormones that are released into the circulation, that is in a low level, that is in the concentration of the hormones that is released by the endocrine gland into the circulation, it is a limited or the low level, at the low level. Therefore the body requires the small amount of the hormones. Now the example of the endocrine gland. First example is the pituitary gland. Second example is the thyroid gland. Third example is the parathyroid gland. Fourth example is the adrenal gland. Fifth example is the pineal gland. Now the location of these different glands, that is the first is the pituitary gland, second one is the hypothalamus. Just below the hypothalamus the pituitary gland is located, and the pineal gland, this is the location of the pineal gland. Now the next example or the location of the example, this is the thyroid gland, and this is your thymus, and this is about the adrenal gland, basically example superior to the kidney, the adrenal glands are located. Now there are some other tissues or the organs, they also releases the some chemicals. They contains the cells that secrete the hormones, but they are not exclusively classified as the endocrine glands. Let's take an example of these tissues or the hormones. First is the hypothalamus, second example is the thymus gland, third example is the pancreas, fourth example is the ovaries, fifth example is the testes, sixth example is the kidney, seven is the stomach, 8th example is the liver, 9th example is the small intestine, 10th example is the skin, 11th example is the heart, 12th example is the adipose tissue, and 13th example is the pancreas. These are the some tissues or the organs. They are basically not exclusively classified as endocrine glands, but these cells, these tissues have certain cells that secrete the specific type of the hormones into the circulation. Now if you see the combination of the endocrine glands and the hormones secreting their cells, these collectively the system of this function of this collectively the system of this endocrine gland and the hormone secreting cells is called as the endocrine glands. And the branch or the science which deals with the structure and functions of the endocrine glands, along with the some disorders as well as the treatment, the the diagnosis and treatment of the disorders associated with the endocrine system. This system is called as the branch of that science is called as the endocrinology. Now the functions of the hormone. The basic function of the hormone is to regulate the chemical composition of the internal environment, or to regulate the volume of the internal environment, that is the interstitial fluid. Again, they regulate the metabolism and energy balance of the bodies, regulate the contraction of the smooth muscle as well as this cardiac muscle fiber. They also regulate the function of the the activation of the immune system. Next, they control the overall growth and development of the body or the body cells. They also regulate the they monitor the operation of the reproductive system. And last is they establish the circadian rhythms, particularly in the body. These are the some functions of the hormones. Now the circulation and the difference between the circulating and local hormones. If you see the circulating hormones, these are secreted by the secretory cells into the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, these hormones diffuse into the blood capillaries and enter into the blood circulation. And from blood circulation, they are distributed throughout the target site or the distinct target sites where they have specific hormone receptor. And after binding to these specific hormone receptor, they monitor the activity, they regulate the activity of the target cells. Whereas the circulating hormones, there are two type of the circulating local hormones, that is the endocrine or the paracrines. This is the secreting cells, and it releases the hormones into the extracellular fluid, and these hormones, they act into the neighboring target cells where they have paracrine receptors, isn't it? And the endocrines, these are the cells, these are released by the secretory cells, and after releasing the hormones, they also act on the same cells, same secretory cells. These are called as the endocrine hormones. Now the chemical classification of the hormone. Basically, hormone, it is classified into two categories. One is the lipid soluble and other one is the water soluble. Lipid soluble hormone, they are again further classified as steroid hormone, thyroid hormone, and the nitric oxide, that is the gas. And the water soluble hormone, they are again classified as the amine hormone, peptide hormone, or the eicosanoids. Now the first lipid soluble hormones, that is the steroid. Basically, these are steroid hormones, these are derived from the cholesterol. Second point, they are unique due to the presence of the different chemical groups. And third, they perform the large diversity of the functions. So let's take an example of the steroid hormones. Say example, kidney releases the secrete the calcitriol. Ovaries secrete the produces the two type of the steroid hormone, that is the estrogen, progesterone. The adrenal cortex produces the three different type of the hormones, that is the aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens. And the testes produces the male sex hormone, that is the testosterone. These are the some organs and associated and their associated hormones, steroid hormones. Now the second example is the thyroid hormone. That is basically, there are two type of the thyroid hormone, that is the triiodothyronine, it is also called as the T3, and fourth one is the thyroxine, that is the tetraiodothyronine, isn't it? So these are synthesized by attaching the iodine to the tyrosine residue, and these are called as the lipid soluble hormones because they contains the two benzene rings. Third classification of that is the steroid hormone is the gas. An example is the nitric oxide, and this nitric oxide act as both hormone as well as the neurotransmitter, and it is synthesized by the catalysis of the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. Now the water soluble hormones. Examples of the water soluble hormones, or the again classification of the water soluble hormone. One is the amines. First, they are synthesized by the removing the carbon dioxide, that is the after decarboxylation, or the synthesized by the some chemical modification into the certain amino acids. These are also called as the amines because they contains the -NH3, that is the amino group. Let's take an example of the amine. Say example catechols, say example epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These are called as the catechol because they contain the catechol moiety, and these are synthesized from the tyrosine. Another example of these amine is the histamine. It is synthesized by the histidine, synthesized from the histidine by the mast cell and the platelet. And third example is the serotonin, that is 5-hydroxytryptamine, and melatonin. These are synthesized from the tryptophan amino acid. Now the peptides and proteins. These are the second class of the that is the water soluble amines, the peptide and proteins. And these are the amino acid polymers. Second, there are smaller peptide hormones, that is nothing but they contain the 3 to 50 amino acid chain. Again, they are also categorized as the larger protein hormones because they contains the more than 50 to 200 amino acid chain residues. Next is the peptide hormone. Example of the peptide hormone is nothing but the antidiuretic hormone or the vasopressin. And the protein hormone, example of the protein hormone is the human growth hormone and insulin. And the protein hormone, that is the thyroid stimulating hormone, it is a unique because it contains a carbohydrate group, so it is also categorized as a glycoprotein. Now there are examples of the peptide and or the protein hormones. Say example, hypothalamus that releases the all hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormones. They are also called as the peptide or the protein hormone. Second example is the posterior pituitary. It releases the oxytocin and ADH. Next, anterior pituitary releases the human growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin. These are also called as the peptide and protein hormones. Next, parathyroid gland releases the parathyroid hormone. It is also categorized as a water soluble, particularly in the peptide and protein category. Next, pancreas releases the insulin and glucagon and somatostatin. It is also categorized as a peptide and protein hormones under water soluble hormone. Next, kidney also releases the erythropoietin. It is also considered as peptide and protein hormones. Next, adipose tissue releases the leptin. Next is the thyroid gland, that is nothing but the follicular cells of the thyroid gland releases the calcitonin. And the last example of the peptide and proteins, that is the stomach and small intestine, release the gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin, that is CCK, and GIP, gastrointestinal inhibitory peptide. These are some examples of the peptide and proteins hormone under the water soluble hormone category. Third example of the water soluble hormone, it is the eicosanoids. These are derived from the arachidonic acid, that is nothing but the 20 carbon fatty acid chain they contains. Second, the example is the type of the eicosanoid is the prostaglandin, and type 2 example of the eicosanoid is the leukotrienes. These eicosanoid hormones, these are important local hormones, and also act on the circulating hormones. Now the moving towards the mechanism of action of the lipid soluble hormones. Already I told that the hormones, they basically after releasing or the secreting from the secretory cells into the interstitial fluid, and after diffusion from the interstitial fluid into the blood capillaries and enter into the blood circulation, these hormones have a specific transporter proteins, and these transporter proteins help in the diffusion of the hormones into the interstitial fluid, and from the interstitial fluid these hormones enter into the target, bind to the receptors present on the target cells. So these hormones, they enter into the plasma membrane, uh, and directly enter into the cytosol, and from cytosol they enter into the nucleus where they have some hormone receptor, and after these the binding of the hormone to a nuclear receptors, the complex of this hormone and the nuclear receptor get into activation, and that initiate the expression of the gene, particularly the synthesis of the mRNA, that is nothing but the gene transcription. So after binding the hormone to the nuclear receptor, they start the gene expression in the form of synthesis of mRNA. That is nothing but the double-stranded DNA is converted into the single-stranded mRNA, and this mRNA, it is going to be transported into the cytosol or the cytoplasm, where they act on the ribosomes and initiate the protein synthesis, or they start to synthesize the new proteins, and after synthesizing the new proteins they alter the cellular activity. That is the mode of action of these lipid soluble hormone. Whereas in comparison to the water soluble hormones, the hormones, they enter into the interstitial fluid and diffuse into the diffuse into the interstitial fluid, and they act on the specific receptor present on the target cell, where they activate the G proteins. After binding the what you can say the G proteins, uh, G proteins, they activate the adenylyl cyclase, and this activation of this adenylyl cyclase activate the start to convert the ATP into the CAMP. That is nothing but the after activation of the adenylyl cyclase, the ATP is converted into the CAMP, and this CAMP start act as a second messenger to activate the proteins, cellular proteins, and these activated proteins, they again activate the activated protein kinase phosphorylate the cellular proteins, and after that they produces the physiological response. So here is the there are two important point as far as the mode of action of the water soluble hormone is concerned. The hormones, they act as the first messenger, and the message of the first messenger is carried or the transported or the that produce the physiological response through the generation of the or the synthesis or the activation of the second messenger system. So in case of the lipid soluble hormone, if you see the in comparison to the what you can say the lipid soluble hormones, the lipid soluble hormones, they directly enter into the or diffuse into the nucleus, where they have the specific nuclear receptors. In case of the water soluble hormones, they act on the outer surface of the cell, that is nothing but the plasma membrane, where they have specific binding receptors, and that binding receptors have the a gene protein component, and the after binding to the hormone to this G protein component, and it is going to be activated, isn't it? So that activate the adenylyl cyclase, and the after activation of the adenylyl cyclase, the CAMP, that is the second messenger system, is activated, and that causes the activation of the cellular proteins or the protein kinase system, and that produces a physiological response. Thank you for kind listening. These are the some references. First is the Principle of the Anatomy and Physiology by Gerard Tortora and Brian Derrickson. That is the third edition. And second example reference is the Textbook of the Medical Physiology by the Guyton and Hall, 11th edition. Thank you.